Well, let's get some analysis now, and we're joined by education expert Dr. Richard Lehasa Moloi. He is an expert and he is with the University of South Africa, UNISA for short. Doctor, thank you very much for your time. Let's begin with what Umalusi has been saying just moments ago, and that is that despite the irregularities, these were not found to be systemic, and therefore they are happy to release the 2022 results. You agree?
Yes. At first, I think there was a concern with regard to the date as to when will they be released from the Department of Basic Education. The date was anticipated for the 19th, which was also now pushed. Given the situation which informed the challenges that informed the writing of this examination, mass protests on account of electricity cuts, learning from the challenges created through COVID-19, departments had to find a way of learning to readjust again. But it is actually quite a positive report to hear that they have basically arrived at the place where they are now actually ready to release the anticipated results, as they directly have an impact in the lives of those who need to proceed to tertiary institutions. And so it is indeed encouraging to hear that they have finally arrived at a place where they are now confident and ready.
Yeah, we'll drill a little later on what needs to be done to avoid the irregularities that have been mentioned. But let's go back to a point that you actually started with, and that's the big talking point right now in the country around the date of the release of the matric results. The date of the 19th is what was announced much, much earlier. Do you think that the outrage is understandable, given that traditionally we would have had these results long released by now? Or is there something to be said about the delay in the release of these results?
Of course, if I look at the glitches between Umalusi and Department of Basic Education, Umalusi wanted some bit of time for their meticulous statistical analysis on the matriculant performance for this year. But you see, citing among other things issues of the impact of COVID-19, remember that in 2020, class results were released somewhere in the earliest of February 2021, and then the 2021 matriculants were released somewhere around the 21st of January. So this year, the date of the 19th was an effort to release them much more earlier. But I think we must also now understand that as much as 2020 was a unique year because of the impact of COVID, we have had about 2 years of how we can learn to now adjust in the times of crisis. So I still do feel that not much efforts were basically done to plan in advance to avoid the crisis. So sometimes the excuse of COVID-19 impact should have then granted us the ability to be able to make swift plans in how we deal with it. But now we are in 2023, not in 2020. So I do feel that to some degree, there hasn't really been that much effective way of planning. But the other aspect that is actually been raised by the Department of Basic Education is the fact that there has been an increase in the number of the enrolled matriculants, which is now close to 1 million. That also now creates a cumbersome kind of challenge to the system and to the markers. But it should also be very important when do they do statistical analysis to know how many markers do they basically need. If that analysis is done at a much more earlier date when students have just registered, then they should be in a better place to be able to prepare.
Yeah.
So I think indeed there is a poverty of planning.
You talk about the poverty of planning, but you're also, in a way, suggesting in your response that this is somehow overwhelming for the system to be able to put checks and balances, which is why you talk about that figure of over 1 million pupils who would have written the 2022 matric exams.
Yes.
That brings me to...
I think we also understand that the culture of...
Yes, please, go on.
Yes, I was simply saying that it is very clear that we cannot ignore the fact that there seems to be critical challenges in government departments to be functional given the challenges with electricity and many other aspects that also impact negatively on the, educational sector itself. So it is part of a collective manifestation of crises that replicates themselves in terms of the functionality of the state facing its own challenges. So education cannot at all be affected. So we are planning in the times of crisis that we are facing. So there was no way that Department of Basic Education itself can be excluded from those challenges.
Let's quickly talk about the irregularities, Dr. Lehasa Moloi. These relate specifically to cheating, also to how the examinations, or should I say the questions themselves, were written during this last examination. So we know about reports last month that came out suggesting that the Department of Basic Education was probing matric exam cheating involving more than 1,000 pupils across 6 provinces. Do you think that this is getting better in terms of its management over the years? Perhaps let's start there.
Yes, indeed. It is embarrassing, but we know that in every examination sitting, these cases cannot be avoided. Cases of where some teachers themselves circulate for money-making schemes, the exam question papers. Those are criminal acts that must be condemned in the highest light. But at the same time, it means that we must continue to invest in the efforts and look at how best we can be able to have protective measures and mechanisms. But yes, it does create unfair advantages for other students who had to really study. But we know that in almost every exam sitting, we do have the criminal acts that would always try to push for an unfair advantage. So this becomes norm, but the concern is to find ways in which those incidents can be reduced.
Very briefly, if you can, still on the very same question, is this getting better with the years, or is the situation getting worse?
It is, without a doubt, getting worse. The reason I'm saying that is that under conditions of crisis where, the teacher-student face-to-face engagement and methods of teaching have been interrupted by many things, people will always try to find some other scrupulous methods of trying to gain advantage. It is without a doubt that the conditions that we find ourselves within in the country, that corruption as a cancer that keeps on spreading affects all different functioning of the departments. And we do find that such incidences are increasing, which then also calls a concern to ethical behavior and the need for the government and the department as an organ in particular to strengthen their efforts by ensuring that we create a much more fair and environment that ensures that there can be fairness. But it is indeed disappointing that we find those incidents increasing.
talking about disappointments, very briefly on this last question, Dr. Lehasa Moloi, the question around the quality control checks by those who are writing these exams or those who are setting these papers. The questions there, as described by Umalusi officials, some of them written in a way that was confusing for the pupils, and they are directed to find or to match sketches. Basically, the arranging of the questions was bad, including some of them which were simply badly written, the questions. That's a blot on the quality control checks. That is something that surely will embarrass the department, and how should that be stopped?
I think it is important because it all relates to the functionality of the quality assurance mechanisms that must be ensured that the questions asked are fair enough and reflective of the overall curriculum and the content which is then being taught, and to ensure clarity of those questions. But all of this is part and parcel of a building block between quality assurers and the teachers who also engage with the students to ensure that there is a clear correlation that understands the outcome that is basically expected, even in terms of how these questions are said. So if ever those who are engaging in terms of teaching our students do not have a clear conception of what sort of quality is basically expected in how they set the questions, it will thus create some sort of a discrepancy. So it therefore invites that measures that are taken in ensuring quality are properly implemented, so that there isn't that kind of a gap that exists between what goes on in the classroom and the outcome at the end of the year that then is the basis on which students are assessed. So all those things are very important in terms of the quality assurance strategies and frameworks and those who implement them. So there is a need and a space for improvement.
Educational expert Dr. Richard Lehasa Moloi, attached to the University of South Africa. Thanks very much for your contribution to this conversation.